Right now, a 300,000-ton steel leviathan, longer than 3 football fields, is moving through the South China Sea. It's carrying $150 million worth of crude oil. But if you look at the official global tracking systems, it doesn't exist. This is a ghost ship. It has no insurance. Its ownership is buried under 6 layers of shell companies, and its transponder was manually disabled 3 days ago. Welcome to the Shadow Fleet, a rogue navy of over 600 tankers that operates outside the reach of the US Treasury, the SWIFT banking system, and international law. While the world watches stock tickers, these ships are the true pulse of global power, moving millions of barrels of sanctioned oil to keep forbidden economies alive. Today, we're exposing the invisible plumbing of the global black market. To understand the money, you have to understand the choke points. In 2022, the G7 slapped a $60 price cap on Russian oil. The goal? Starve the Kremlin's war machine without crashing the global economy. It sounded perfect on paper, but the West forgot one thing: money finds a way. The Shadow Fleet works through 3 layers of deception. First, the zombies. These are aging vessels that should have been sold for scrap, but mysterious buyers pay double the market rate in cash to keep them afloat. Second, flag hopping. A ship might be registered in Panama in the morning, Comoros by noon, and Gabon by sunset. It's legal camouflage. And third, the Great Switch. This is the supertanker secret. It's called ship-to-ship transfer. Imagine 2 giants meeting in the middle of the ocean, far from any coast. The dark ship pumps its sanctioned oil into a clean ship. They mix it with a little bit of legal oil, and suddenly, that forbidden crude is rebranded as a Singaporean blend. In 2023, analysts tracked a 400% increase in these transfers. This isn't just about hiding oil, it's about liquidity. This oil is sold in yuan or dirhams, bypassing the US dollar entirely. Every barrel moved this way is a direct hit to the petrodollar hegemony. There are 3 places where the Shadow Fleet is most vulnerable and most dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz, the jugular, where 20% of the world's oil passes. The Danish Straits, where Russia plays a high-stakes game of environmental chicken. And the Voldemort hubs, places like the Maldives, where ships go dark for weeks at a time. This is the ultimate grey zone conflict. If the West cracks down too hard, oil prices spike to $150 a barrel. If they don't, the power axis stays funded. We are witnessing the birth of a parallel economy. One system is transparent and regulated. The other is dark, chaotic, and fueled by the Shadow Fleet. Nearly 10% of the global tanker fleet is now part of this network. The result? The global control once held by the West is leaking. You cannot sanction a ghost. You cannot freeze the assets of a ship that technically doesn't have an owner. Money isn't just numbers in a bank anymore. It's millions of tons of invisible crude moving through the choke points of the world at 15 knots. The Shadow Fleet is a massive floating middle finger to the established global order. It's how the sanctions stay powerful and how the rules-based order is being rewritten, one barrel at a time. But there's one country that has mastered this game better than anyone else. Would you like me to break down how the UAE has become the world's sanction-proof hub next? See you in the next one.